of the International Development Select Committee's inquiry into basically the future of UK aid development, what its priorities are and should be. As many of you know, the UK government is going through the process of deciding what its priorities are going to be. Unfortunately, deciding where the 40% of cuts to its aid programme are going to land. So it was really important for us as a committee to try and get as many voices as we possibly could to say what is important and where our country's priorities should be. We've had almost 200 organisations and individuals submit evidence to us, and we're very, very pleased that today we are here in King's College, and some of the questions that we have been fed into us by the students. It's a really key topic for Britain's place in the world, and so we're very grateful for everybody that's fed into our inquiry, and we hope it will be coming out in the coming weeks, and we hope that it will have some influence. We're really fortunate to have two panels today, witnesses for our first panel. I wonder if I could ask you to introduce yourselves, tell us about the work that you're doing, and also, if you don't mind, you're each from different countries, tell us about the main challenges and opportunities that your country is facing right now. Sapphire, could I ask you to introduce yourself first, please?
Yes, definitely. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Sapphire. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is the southernmost island in the Caribbean. And I'm the founder of a young feminist collective called Caribbean Feminist that works on intersectional gender justice from a Caribbean lens. So we work with feminists in the Caribbean and the wider diaspora on initiatives at the intersection of gender, climate, reproductive justice, and the list goes on. Some of the key areas that we face here in Trinidad and Tobago and that are very much connected to the work that we do are gender inequality. And I don't think that that's a unique experience. I think all of us can share in that. Another one is gender-based violence, and by extension, crime and violence on a whole. I think last year, for a population of 1.5 million, our crime rate was something close to 992 instances of crime. So for a population size that's small, you can see that this is a huge risk for us. Another one is that because we're a small island developing state, climate change is a huge risk factor. Even though we contribute less than 1% to global emissions, our impact for climate change, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but for the wider region, is quite significant. If we look at recent examples of Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica and Hurricane Beryl the year before, we are seeing natural disasters at a scale that we have never seen before that are ravaging huge damage to our region. And that bleeds into something that you also spoke about within the strategic plan for stage, which is on debt and the way that the Caribbean islands and small island developing states are particularly vulnerable to debt as a result of climate-induced poverty. And so that is another issue that we want to talk about here today. And I hope that we have time for climate resilience and equitable financing for small island developing states. Thank you so much.
Sapphire, thank you very much. That was really clear. Chido, could I turn to you? Tell us about the work that you do, and also particularly thinking about Zimbabwe. Are there particular challenges that you're facing right now or particular opportunities that we need to be aware of?
Thank you very much. My name is Chido Govera from Zimbabwe, and I am the founder of an organization that is called the Future of Hope Foundation. This organization I started in 2013, really building up from my own experiences, growing up in a rural village, becoming an orphan as a young girl, and having to be responsible for putting food on the table as a very young girl. As a result of that, I was already out of school by the time I was 9 years old, and I was going to be married off by the time I was 10 years old. But luckily, I learned one technical skill that turned everything around. I learned to farm mushrooms, and thanks to that, I was able to find something that could turn my life around and come to where I am today. When I look at the challenges that my organization works to address today, it's really finding the young woman that is me in the village who has all these burdens of food security, income security, nutrition as an issue, and to see how do we address these issues in a sustainable way? How do we help people to help themselves so that they can really stand up and reach their full potential? So, and the opportunities that I see with this is that because we have a lot of things that are not working well, there's also a chance really to push young people at the forefront, people who experience these hardships at the forefront, so they can be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Chido, I'm slightly obsessed by mushrooms, so I was very excited that you were going to be on the panel. And finally, Finian, I wonder, same question to you, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Chair. My name is Finian Ali, a Nigerian-based nutrition advocate. I am a migration scholar and a development research fellow. My work focuses mainly on nutrition, on youth livelihood, and also community-led development, particularly with marginalized young people and women. So I work very closely with grassroots groups, with youth networks across different parts of Nigeria, including very hard-to-reach communities. I am also very much involved in migration governance and management in my country, as well as skills development programs, particularly programs that have reached thousands of young people within the fashion and leather work sector, in ICT, and also supporting them to transition into decent work and into even more stable livelihood. So in terms of key challenges peculiar to Nigeria, I would like to highlight just three. And the first one is particularly very much rampant in the country, and that is the issue of malnutrition and food insecurity, especially all over the country actually, but much more in the northern part of Nigeria. And this is largely driven by rising food costs, also by issues around poverty, climate change, and also very fragile local food systems. And we know that children, young people, and women are very much affected by this, including those in conflict-affected communities as well. Then a second challenge that is usually not talked about is around youth unemployment and also youth underemployment. I think underemployment should have very large emphasis because a lot of people, very brilliant minds, earn very low compared to the value that they bring. And this is also quite a fantastic migration pressure for them. And they want to opt for, irregular routes to get their satisfaction met. And this is largely also because many young people lack access to practical market-relevant skills, even capital or even clear pathways into decent work. And then the third challenge that I think is also quite very relevant to this conversation is around systemic challenges, because most interventions that happen here in the country, especially donor-funded interventions, are quite short-termed. They are usually always fragmented, and not oftentimes they are not owned by the community that the interventions are designed for. They're always externally driven, and when funding is reduced or maybe reprioritized, we begin to see programs stalling, and we begin to see communities being left without support or without even visible need for resilience. Then one major opportunities that the UK may want to really eyeball is that Nigeria, if you want to talk about Nigeria, you want to talk about the population, you want to talk about the people. So one of our greatest assets is our people, particularly Nigeria is a very young population. We have young people, we have women, and these people are already leading solutions at community level, from nutrition advocacy to skills to social accountability. All these things are happening. So these are things that are kind of low-hanging fruit, and many young people are quite really open to new things, and they are really open to learn and to diversify just to make sure that they have better livelihood and also better prospect for life. Thank you.
Finian, I wonder if I could ask your comments. AJ, who's the president of the World Bank, said that migration caused to youth unemployment is going to be one of the biggest global challenges. Do you agree with him? Yes,
I do agree with him because if you look at Nigeria, for instance, there is a lot of young people are being driven by the push to migrate. And this is largely because there are no jobs. And secondly, even those who have jobs, they are underemployed. And when you are underemployed, it's already a migration pressure on its own. And then thirdly, a lot of young people don't feel safe. There is insecurity and people are worried because locally here, when we talk about safety, Nigeria is no longer a place that you say that crises are just temporary. We now have very recurrent crises, very overlapping crises. So what it means is that people are not safe, you know, and this can very much be a migration push factor. And for those of our young people who are within the labor market age, there are also prospects for better value for the support and for the skills that they provide. So why would you want to continue to work when you don't get the best, you know? But what we try to do is to support young people to explore regular routes, because of course migration is also quite very healthy. It also has its global benefit. It also helps in development as well. So we cannot exonerate those advantages, but we have to ensure that it is in line with the global compact. Is it safe? Is it orderly? Is it regular? So these are the critical areas. So I perfectly align with that. Locally here, also particularly within the health sector, we have cases of, you know, going to the hospital and you don't get the best of professionals to support you because, you know, we have brain drain. So it's really something that is locally a reality. Thank you.
The committee is aware I'm slightly obsessed about my view, the short-sighted cutting aid rather than keeping people safe, secure and prosperous in their own countries. Can I turn to James, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, panellists, for your contributions today. If I can come to Chido first, how do you think that the approach to development, clearly our conversation today is about the future of UK aid, how do you think that the approach to development of countries like the UK should change in order to still maintain a significant impact in the investments that they can continue to make? Coming to Chido?
Excuse me, that was not very clear. May you please repeat?
Oh, yeah. So the UK's approach to aid is obviously going to have to change, and other countries are making similar adjustments. How do you think that the UK and others can continue to have a large impact while also making the appropriate changes?
So one of the major changes in approach for me is to really work out better ways of investing in local organizations. And I think to shift from really treating development work as just development, not an investment. What does that mean when you look at local organizations today? I run a local organization, and I know lately there's a push to say organizations should work more in consortiums to mobilize resources. But when you go to look at how does it work in these consortiums, always the international organizations are the leaders of these consortiums. They decide how resources are kind of distributed. They decide always how much time is money spending in the hands of implementers. And today what we see is it feels a lot like local organizations are just conduits of pushing money from one point to another. And sometimes the time that the money is spending in the field is not enough to actually have an impact. So we're always chasing some deadlines of you have this money, you have from now until then to use it. And we don't really have a say. As a local organization, especially today, I have moments where I have seen grants calls and I'm thinking, is this worth my time? Or am I just going to be running around to meet a deadline and not quite making the impact that I want to make? What is the impact that would make sense to me? As I mentioned earlier, I work in mushroom production. We are teaching local households to take agricultural waste, convert that into mushrooms, which are used for food, which are brought to the market so that they can have income. And then they have, of course, additional nutrition. If you look at communities where we work, these are communities with human-wildlife conflicts. These are communities where conventional agriculture does not perform as it used to do. But when we have to work with the current arrangements of how resources are coming. We have to do these things at a speed that doesn't make sense at all. As an investment, we are not really yielding the benefit of the resources that are already available. Now we face cuts, and we still face the reality that international organizations, which are also more expensive, if you look at a person who has the same position as me, in an international organization, what they earn is so much more. They are doing the same or sometimes even less than what I am doing, but I don't get to benefit from getting the same. And I think we need to shift that. We need to shift and see to it that when we encourage people to work in consortiums, we need to be intentional about saying, one moment, an international organization leads a consortium and decides the course of things, but that has to rotate within any group of partners. It has to move, and there needs to be investment in making sure that the local organizations are also able to lead, so that you're not continuously sidelined because I think you don't have the right capacities. It is important to invest in building these capacities for local organizations, but also we need to embrace more and more operating like social enterprises. Some of us are working with very technical things that you can turn into value that is not just value for the communities that are at the receiving end of this, but also for the organization itself. That means we need to be intentional about investing in the right research and development. If you look today in mushroom farming, there are many things that are happening in the same setups. Where we today grow mushrooms for food, you can grow mushrooms for making building materials, you can grow mushrooms for medicine, but we hardly ever have resources that allow us to explore this and bring this benefit to the communities that we serve, because when resources come, they are a little bit organized in a way that does not allow the freedom to be creative, to get the most impact. And the chase is always, let's finish and go to the next grant. And there's not enough resources. We need to change this, and we need to make sure that we build capacities in a different way than we have done before. That in the organization itself is an investment as much as in the communities at the end of the line.
Thank you for that. A couple of really clear points there. A lot of nodding going on from our fellow panelists. Sapphire, is there anything you want to build on there, or any specific additional points that you'd like to make about what the UK and other countries can do to still have the biggest impact?
Yes, so I really echo Chido's words on the importance of investment in grassroots organizations. We always call within the feminist space for flexible core multi-year funding for nonprofits and organizations, because this is the type of funding that is needed. I also always advocate for a participatory approach to the grant making and grant design process, because it's not enough to just give funding to people. We need to be able to help design the way that funding is disseminated, because we know best what our communities need and how that needs to be disseminated. I love what Chido was sharing about social enterprises and the importance of moving beyond these very restrictive funding guidelines to say that this is what the money has to be spent on. It has to be spent on this program. We are dealing with contexts that are very volatile. We may start a project working on climate and labor, which is something that we work on in the Caribbean, and we might be ravaged by a hurricane. So we may need to divert that funding to support our communities in disaster resilience and crisis response.
So,
we should be able to do that with the funding that we have. I also think investing for resilience is really important, to ensure that with the money that is invested into these grassroots organizations, into our communities, we're able to build our capacity, as Chido said, so that we're not dependent on this grant cycle, that, as we know, comes with volatility. We're seeing that huge shift within the global financial architecture, where there's less and less money going to grassroots organizations, and even less than that going to feminist or youth-led organizations.
And
so it's really important for us to have folks to commit to continued core flexible investment in young feminist organizations and in grassroots work, so that we can ensure that we are addressing all of these issues that my fellow panelists have raised.
And so from a UK perspective, or from a developing countries perspective, how do you think their interaction would look and feel different in the future? What do you think would be the right approach from a United Kingdom?
So So as I was talking about earlier, that participatory grant making approach. So when you're designing the type of funding that's being disseminated, you're doing consultations with communities. And I've seen this in practice. There's a grant called Education Shifts Power that was created by UNGAI in participation with young feminist organizations. So they were there at every step of the process, helping to design how grants are disseminated, what reporting looks like, what key areas need to be addressed. And so they were designers of the grant and recipients. So they were able to ensure that the benefit that that funding had for them and their communities was exactly what was needed to address the core issues that were addressed. So there was one organization that worked on climate resilience in Brazil. There was another that worked on education and capacity building within rural communities in Uganda, one that worked on child marriage, and they were not restricted by what needed to be funded by the granting. They were able to design again they were able to assign funding based on what needs they saw within their communities.
Thank you for that. So, Finian, anything else that you'd like to add about what you think the UK or other developing countries could do to shift their behaviours but still have maximum impact?
Sorry, is that question for me? I don't think.
Yeah, so same question effectively to you. Same question.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. So my hand was already up because I wanted to share some thoughts in alignment with Chido's comment. But first, let me also emphasize that one of the biggest changes that we need to adopt this time moving forward would be to kind of look at how do we move beyond, the artificial separation between humanitarian aid and relief kind of with long-term development. Because in contexts like Nigeria, like I said earlier, crises are no longer temporary. They are recurring, they are overlapping. So relief is quite essential, but when it is not connected to longer term systems like livelihood, like local markets, like skills, like employment, like nutrition, overall, like health, then of course the communities will still remain vulnerable because you just come, provide relief, and then next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, they go back to square one and they have to start afresh. They don't have job, they don't have market, they don't have improved livelihood, they don't have improved, even household economy, they don't even have improved health when they go back to, their homes. And they become quite very dependent. They become also quite very vulnerable. So I think we need to have that shift. And then secondly, I would also want to emphasize on, community ownership, for instance. I'm going to give an instance. There was a program that I was involved. That program was designed to combat irregular, youth migration, as well as provide skills acquisition. So in designing that program, we engage the communities, the young people, to kind of ask, how do you want to learn the skill? The big goal is not what they want to hear. The big goal is to discourage them from irregular migration, but that's not what they want to hear. So we want to ask them, how do you want to learn skills that will give you a better livelihood in the future? And they propose the apprenticeship model that they want to learn in such a way that they are placed with a mastercraft person, and with support of the mastercraft person, they can get equipment support, they can learn with the mastercraft, and they can stay there for 2 years, even 3 years. And we weren't thinking this as a program, as a movement, we weren't thinking this, but this has already helped us achieve that level of localization, that level of ownership, that if we had wanted to design a training for them for 5 months, now they already even want to do that training for 2 years by doing apprenticeship. So localized training structures and community ownership is quite very critical, because with that, we can get the desired results. So these two are really very critical. So when we talk about consortium, like my colleague Adelia shared, for us as young people, it may not even be our intention to start creating non-government organization, following all the registration protocols. These are things we do every day. Like you wake up in the morning, you just want to have your tea. It's what we do every day. So those are very low-hanging fruit that can be leveraged. When we want to design programmatic implementation that requires young people to be part of it, it has to be very, very intentional, that it allows young people to participate. And we have to look for youth networks and youth-led organizations and support them. Because sometimes the complexity around this application is quite very discouraging. You need to apply, you need to submit this, do this budget, and so on. You just get, let's continue what we are doing the way we are doing it, and let's just leave it, because oftentimes you may not even get it. So I align with him 100% that we need to see how we can simplify some of these compliance processes, even reporting, even funding mechanisms. We can find a structure that makes it easier for young people, because it is easier for young people to influence young people because they listen to each other than when someone outside a demography is providing that context and support.
Thank you very much. Over to Janet.
Oh, good afternoon. I'm going to come to Finian first, and I can hear your passion for young people, and I know you serve in many roles to do with advocating and empowering young people, and you've mentioned some of the aims that you have, the 3 aims in particular, as well as young population in Nigeria, and I will come to the other panellists as well to be able to contribute. But I just wanted to ask Finian to begin first, that how you feel, or how best you feel the UK can support young people in the causes that you are fighting for, and considering how you would empower them really, and what influence the UK could play in offering that level or some support.
Sorry, we could not hear you.
Oh, can you not hear me at all? Can you hear me now?
No, it's breaking up a lot.
It's breaking up a lot. Well, I don't really know how to fix that. Can you hear me now at all? Can you hear me now? No? Shall I, shall we try yours? Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now at all? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I'll be a lot more succinct than I was just now. So I'm going to come to Finian first, and I really just want to ask your view really on how you feel the UK can best support young people in the causes that you are fighting for, and thinking about how you could empower them and advocate for them really. Finian, are you okay to go first?
All right. Thank you. I got the question. I think that some of the strategies have already been shared when Chido and I reflected the past few minutes. But let me just also emphasize that for young people, particularly for also young community activists, I think what we need is the space, the platform, and also the resources and the trust, because oftentimes people feel like, we don't trust young people, they won't get it right, but we've done it and we've gotten it right. Like a good instance is the current program that I'm doing with the Scaling Up Nutrition Civil Society Network under the Youth Leader for Nutrition program. So through this program, we've been able to set up the first and the only youth network in Nigeria within the SUN movement. And we have youth advocates across the 6 geopolitical zones in the country doing excellently well, leading community dialogues, listening to young people like themselves, and trying to influence policy actions within their states. So I think what we need is just the space, we need the resources, we need the trust, because when you want to talk about real support, I think it begins with, even listening to us, even working together with us. So, funding youth-led and community-led initiative directly, and even providing support, especially when it is asked for, because oftentimes what the models are usually one size fits all. Like, when we design this, it can apply to all young people. It's not so, because there are evolving realities, there are different dynamics. And it also means that we need to begin to recognize lived experiences, and we need to value this knowledge. Just like Chido shared her experience in her introduction about, what her upbringing, her childhood age was like, and the vulnerabilities with that, that's enough, can inform program design and can help, other young girls and teenagers who may face or who are currently even facing such challenges, not just in Zimbabwe, but across Africa and even across the world. Very, very helpful. So we need to really begin to treat, lived experiences as quite very credible evidences and an important step forward. And I think one practical step that the UK can take is that UK may consider to begin to provide more predictable, multi-year funding, not fragmented. Like your funding is just 1 year, just 6 months, just 2 years, because it has to be integrated into other systems, not just what the program is aiming to achieve. And it has to be fully aligned. And secondly, like I said earlier, we need to simplify this funding and reporting process so that smaller local actors can also assess it. And we need to intentionally ensure that, if funding are to be released, it can even go directly to who is supposed to receive it, so that in terms of design, we are involving local leaders. In terms of implementation, they are also critically aligned and participatory in the process. So that's what I would like to share. Thank you.
That's really helpful, in particular around the whole funding and needing the medium to long-term support in that area. Chido, was there anything you wanted to add to that? No? Or Sapphire? Was there anything you wanted to add? Sapphire, go ahead.
Yes, I can definitely add to that. I definitely agree with what Finian has shared. I think that it is important to resource young people. It's also important to support them beyond just tokenized representation, beyond just having them as a byline. Mentorship is also an area that is incredibly important, capacity building support. I can say firsthand that there was an initiative that the British High Commission here in Trinidad and Tobago ran quite a few years ago, probably in 2018, called British High Commissioner for a Day. And it was all about enhancing the access of young people to decision-making spaces and introducing them to diplomacy. I was able to participate in that program, and that was something that is truly transformative. And that is something that we need more of, because young people, as Finian shared, as Chido shared, are leading work that is revolutionizing communities. I can list so many organizations. There's Girls Care in Jamaica that is providing avenues for young women to engage in climate justice and resilience work. They were leading the charge after Hurricane Melissa in documenting the gendered implications of the climate crisis. I could talk about the Ashley Foundation that is bridging the intersection of climate and health and engaging a new generation of young people to understand how their health is implicated by the climate crisis, and how healthy life choices, how food security, how education can transform their lives and the lives of others in the region. I can also talk about the Autism and Friends Network in Trinidad and Tobago that is revolutionizing access for persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. These are areas that our governments have not been able to invest fully in, and through the agency of young people, through organizations led by young people, we are seeing a huge difference. And these are all organizations as well that have been supported by official development assistance by the British government. And I also wanted to talk about the existing mechanisms. You have things like the Commonwealth Network that already exists. We need to fortify these networks. We need to invest more in them, to use these networks of support, these funding mechanisms, to really enhance the experience of young people. The structure already exists. Let's just invest more in it. And I love that point that Finian made, that we can't have to go beyond fragmented funding. We need to have structured funding that happens every single year, so that we know, okay, every year, these are the grants that we can apply for. We don't have to be looking on 15 million different pages to see where the funding is going to come from this year. We know that this is a set initiative that can come, and that they're going to invest in us over a longer period of time, so that our work is not reactive. It can be transformative, because we have the funding set, so we know we can invest in this capacity building, paying staff. That's a huge issue for youth-led organizations as well, to be able to support the labor of the people who are doing the work. So those are just some of the ways, these tangible ways that we can invest in youth organizations and better support young people.
Thank you. I can see your hand, Chido. That's very helpful. The vulnerability to climate change, storms and hurricanes in the Caribbean is extremely alarming, and it's great that the young people are finding a space to make an active contribution. But hear you exactly on all of those points. So thank you for that. So Chido, would you like to come in? Over to you, Chido.
Sorry, I will take us a little bit back to the issue of approaches. And I will share an experience that I recently had in Mozambique. I went because there's this push to promote youth economic empowerment. And I'm there with one organization who's saying, yeah, let's go for skills, let's do this. And in a distance of about 10 meters from where I am, there's somebody who's just distributing food. and people have to choose between coming to me or going to where they get food for free. Speaking of the artificial separation between, relief and development, that, we are different organizations, most likely getting funding from same sources, but the way that these things are packaged, one who's receiving funding to do the food distributions is not quite aligned with one who's trying to push for skills that continuously we make communities have to choose. Should I go there or just go there where I can get a bag of rice today? And I think there's need also to invest in building this alignment across all the donor community to say, when we are working in a community, we should not just talk about relief on its own. It's relief and investment into continuity in the communities, and that we need to find a way of giving each other space to allow the communities to understand that we need to layer all these things. They need to be able to exist at the same time. That's another critical thing that I would say in terms of approaches. We need to have the funding organizations communicate to each other and try to make more alignment there. And in terms of what could be the responsibility of the UK to help make things better, I really am a big supporter of having youth be part of the curators of some of the decisions that we make about what we do. We talked about migration earlier. You look in the UK, you look in many parts of the world, you have a lot of people who've left our countries in search of better opportunities, but they are keen to do something back home. They're keen to invest back home, and they are full of ideas. And I think it is important to create a kind of committee where we have all different young people from different parts of our countries, of the continent, where we can really help to fine-tune, not just from this traditional development perspective where we just have to keep repeating the same thing, but that we can really challenge and propose new areas, especially in terms of technical expertise, new areas to invest in, correctly choose where is the most critical need, where we can address now, who are the best persons actually to put at the forefront of this. So I think it would be interesting to see what that could look like. To give an example, I am currently, since about 2-3 years, I'm based in Belgium, and the ICMPD has a program where they actually invest in making sure that people in the diaspora stay connected to their countries. And thanks to that, I was able to actually look at the work that I have done with my organization since 2013 and see where are the gaps where I can invest in. And I was able to present that to them. They made resources available where for the first time, I was able to go back to Zimbabwe to bring regulators together, institutions, and different entrepreneurs who are working to try and say, how do we build a mushroom industry of this country? And to talk and to see how we can plan this together. But these resources are not usually available. I will have money to work on it in one remote part of the country, but I can't really bring the regulators to take part in this because this money is for that specific district. And I think adjusting this, building really capable teams that combine the diaspora and the local community, working together and trying to build these technical skills in a fashion that allows us to not have to go the long route of solving problems, but that we can get there fast by fusing what the young people in the local community are experiencing and wanting to solve, but also what the young Africans in the diaspora have already experienced and they see as beneficial to their communities back home.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Chido, that was really helpful. And I think you've hit on the nub of the problem that the sector is facing right now. There's aid for humanitarian, aid for development, and in the examples that you gave, quite often they're tripping each other up. Rather than looking at how they can either unite together or deal with separate issues. So thank you for those examples. Sophia, I wonder if I can come back to you. You said governments have not been able to support youth. I would put to you that they chose not to support youth. What do you think about that?
I think that sometimes even the governments with the best intentions, because of the many areas that need investment within our local societies and economies, they're not able to invest fully into social justice initiatives. I don't think that that should be the case. And unfortunately, it is that when there's something like a hurricane or natural disaster, flooding, etc., funds are diverted there first and they are taken from things like gender initiatives, from things like support for persons with disabilities. So what happens then is that nonprofit civil society come in and they have to fill in the gap that is left by those funding restrictions. And then also we're talking about the wider context of debt, where most of our countries, which have been formerly colonized, live in this never-ending cycle of sovereign debt that we have to support. So that also restricts the way that governments are able to determine where funding needs to go.
And
So
do you think, Sapphire, do you think
yes.
it's right that NGOs or other governments are coming in and filling those gaps, or is their role more to influence the state to prioritise those areas?
Sorry, I lost you a little bit for that question.
So do you think it's right that NGOs or other governments are coming into countries and plugging the gaps, I think was your example, your language, or should it be that their role is to influence and support governments to do this themselves?
I think there's value in partnership. I think there's value in all of these different players playing a role in the way that this funding is disseminated. Because yes, part of the issue can be that government does not have enough resources to support all of the initiatives, and another can be that government does not see it as a priority. So for in cases where, let's say for LGBTQ plus organizations, for example, they are never going to be a byline if things like homosexuality is criminalized in a country. But that's a justice issue that civil society organizations then come in and support through the support of official development assistance. So I think it's not easy to summarize and say that it should just be the government that gets to determine where all funding goes, because there are issues with that framing as well. It needs to be a partnership between all of the actors, all of these stakeholders within this.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I hand over to my colleague, Brian.
I hope you can hear me okay. So my section is called From Grants to Expertise. And I've got three short questions. I'm going to put them one after another. But first of all, to Chido, I should say Zvakanaka, and for your work with mushroom farming. It sounds fantastic. So Chido, what is the place for technical assistance in the UK's development assistance offer?
May you please repeat the question?
What is the place for technical assistance in the UK's development assistance offer?
I think that should become a top priority, because we need the right skills, the right technical skills to be able to compete on the same level as everyone else. We have a lot of challenges. If I will give, of course, an example from mushroom farming, because that's a thing that we are busy with. But also other areas of food production as livelihoods is actually a key foundation where everything hinges. If you look at what some of the things that we still practice, we are still practicing things that the rest of the world is busy trying to move away from, and to update these skills so that we avoid investing in things that are already getting outdated, or getting our knowledge updated fast is actually very critical. It should be the first thing. So next to ensuring that people survive today, they have to have the right skills, and I think there's merit in really making that top priority.
Okay, and Sapphire, the next question to you, and that is, how can these be designed in an empowering way?
How can technical assistance be designed in an empowering way?
Yes.
That's the question.
Yes.
Okay, so I think that going back to, again, consultations with communities to better understand what needs they have. So what is the capacity that they need? We were talking about youth unemployment earlier. What are the skills that young people need to start their own businesses, to be competitive within the workforce? How do we strengthen their capacity in that instance? If we're looking at civil society, do they need support with grant making? Do they need technical support in how to apply for grants, how to find grants? Do they need technical support in how to lobby to politicians, how to craft policy, those kinds of things? So it's about going into the communities, understanding what their needs are and how we can better support them directly through their interventions. We're not doing that helicopter approach where we come in and we decide what is needed. No, we allow them to design, co-design the technical assistance process.
Thank you. And Finian, to you, what else should be considered to maximize the effectiveness of technical assistance programs?
Sorry, could you please
I'll
come again?
repeat.
Sorry.
What else should be considered to maximize the effectiveness of technical assistance programs?
Okay, that's clear now. Thank you. So I would like to suggest that first, technical assistance can be very valuable, just like Chido has shared in her comment, but it has to respond to locally identified needs rather than externally defined gaps. So in this case, we need to understand what do the community need, the country, what do they need, so that the expatriate support, the technical assistant will be able to close that gap. And what that also implies is that in practice, it has to start with local institutions and communities even coming together to articulate what systems strengthening, what data, what skills transfer, or what even policy advice is really relevant, and international partners can begin to respond to that demand. And I think that is also quite very relevant because it will need to be time bound if that support is coming, and it has to be focused on building local capability, just like what Chido has shared with ICMPD program. There's also a program that GIZ is doing in Nigeria that is very similar to that, that has to do with expat return. They support Nigerian citizens who are outside of the country to be able to return, to provide that expat support to their country of origin. So it has to be something that builds on local capability, because if it is not doing that, if it is substituting for local capability, then it's going to still make the company dependent on the technical assistance forever. So someone has to understudy what one is doing, so that in the long term there will be easy transitioning and those skills can be sustainable. So I think one more other thing that needs to change is in terms of how that technical assistance is received. As much as possible, there needs to be this community acceptance, that's one, and there needs to be that bilateral understanding so that the support can be domesticated locally. It doesn't just happen within a particular community, and it doesn't cascade, because if it is not owned by the country, it cannot be modeled, it cannot be scaled. So technical assistance are quite very useful when they are well provided. It can give a country opportunity to even scale, in terms of scale and in terms of support. And that model can be replicated across different counties, different states, and can even help in terms of closing very visible skill gaps like what Chido has shared on it. Thank you.
Witnesses, you have been so clear and helpful in the information that you've given to us. It is really going to help us with our report to government. You've all come up with some fantastic opportunities, but also some of the slightly ridiculous hurdles that you have to get over. But I admire all of you. Thank you so much for making time for us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you and goodbye, unless you want to stay and watch the rest of the session. If I could invite the second panel to come up in front of us, please. Oh, there's a grand entrance coming. Thank you very much. Panelists and audience, I'm afraid you have the slightly surreal experience of A, seeing their backs, but panelists seeing yourselves. So, which, I mean, for me would be horrifying, but for you might be a delight. So, yeah, I can't think of, I hate watching myself back, so apologies that you're in that situation. I wonder if we could go straight into it. I'm going to start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves, your organisation, and you are aware of why we're doing this inquiry. So we want to get into the details of what you think we should be pushing, how the government should best use its ODA spend, and most importantly, how we can communicate it to the people whose money it is, i.e. the taxpayers. Belle, could you start introducing yourself and your organisation, please? Apparently we have to switch them off and on when we are or aren't speaking.
Good to know. Hi, my name is Trew. I'm the Chief International Correspondent of The Independent. I'm also a documentary filmmaker and a photographer, and I've been working on a project that we're running called Rethinking Global Aid. So our focus has been very, very much on this very, very issue for the last year.
And can I say to people, if you haven't read the associated articles, they're really good. So thank you for all the work you're doing in this space. Luke.
I'm Luke Tryl. I'm the Executive Director of More in Common in the UK, and we've conducted a significant amount of public opinion research into aid and development.
And Jennifer?
Afternoon. Jennifer Hudson, Vice Provost Faculties at UCL and Director of the Development Engagement Lab. We've been looking at public attitudes towards aid and development in UK, US, France and Germany for about a decade.
And same as I said to the first panel, we'll direct questions to each of you individually, but please do come in, butt in, give me the...
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I want to first ask the panel about public perception of aid policy. So I will come to Jennifer and Luke first, if that's okay. What does your data tell us about what the public think about the current UK government's approach to aid?
So I think I'll answer in two ways. One, if you ask the average person on the street, what is the UK government's approach to aid, I think you would be met with silence, because I don't think it's something that people carry hand on heart, kind of the specifics of what government is doing. That said, what the public really care about are things like, is aid being spent? Is it impactful? And is there value for money? And I'll come back to that, I'm sure, at different points today. This is a thing that people want to know. Are we getting value for money? Because it's right that if we are spending taxpayers' money, that we do it in a way that is really making a difference. So I think that's what they would tell you. Now, more specifically in the data that we have, if you ask the public what the priorities for UK aid spending are, they will tell you three things, and they will tell you three things over the last decade that we have seen. They want to prioritize health, education, and WASH spending. Those are just the three areas that align with how the public think that the enterprise of UK aid should be allocated. And there hasn't been much movement in that over the last 10 years. And I think that really just goes to a very strong sense that the purpose of aid is to help those in need, as a strong sense of why we're doing this and why we should continue to do this. And I'll pause there.
I don't think I'll surprise the committee by saying that aid in the UK has somewhat of a perception challenge amongst the public. When we ask the public the words they most associate with aid, wasteful and ineffective are the two that come out on top. There is more support than opposition for providing aid. So 47% think we should provide aid, 28% think that we shouldn't. But even in the context of the significant cuts to the aid budget that we have seen in our latest tracking, people are still more likely, 50%, to say that we should spend less on aid than spend more on aid, 13% there. So there clearly is a perception challenge. I absolutely agree with what Jennifer has said around the priorities, particularly on what are seen as quite tangible humanitarian issues are very important for the public. But I would add another dimension that increasingly, and I think it's important to look at people's upstream attitudes, which are shaping how they think about aid. at a time when the public purse is seen as constrained, people think that the UK as a whole is struggling, we find that there is significant support for mutual benefit arguments when it comes to aid, that it can benefit both the recipient but also us here in the UK, and we think that's of growing importance, and it's particularly important for those who are inclined to be more sceptical of aid.
Yeah, just on that point, I was just wondering how accurate is the public's perception of how much money is actually being spent on aid in the UK? Have either of you looked at that, and is it accurate or is it not?
It's wildly inaccurate. Some research that we did many years ago, average estimate is 25% of the UK budget goes to overseas aid. When you ask people what they think we should spend on aid, they said about 9% of the budget. When you then tell them what we actually spend on the UK aid budget, they want to drop it even further. And so I think there's this challenge here that often the way we talk about the aid budget is an input. We spend X billion on aid. And that's a really difficult conversation for the public to have. $1 billion is a lot of money. And so, of course, their natural instinct is to cut. But I would posit that while it's true they probably want to cut aid a little bit more than other areas, if you ask the public about do they want to cut government spending, they probably want to do it in most places, say for the NHS and maybe their local schools, because of this perception of inefficiency, wastage, corruption that's particular to this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think I would perhaps be tempted to be slightly more generous to the public. It is very definitely true that there is an overestimate, but I think part of that overestimate, particularly when the public are dealing with large numbers, is about signalling something. It's about signalling that we think that this has slightly got out of whack. And this is not our polling, this is from Focal data, but when they were asked about areas that spending could be decreased, overseas aid was the most selected area, 5 times more selected than the next most popular area for spending reductions.
Can I add a point in there? Just because we did our own survey of our readers, and before we started this project, I'm an international correspondent. I am very well aware of just how much the public its attention span has been taken from everything that's happening. I mean, January has felt like a year already. I was actually quite surprised by the engagement we've had in the stories on aid. Which, really I thought weren't going to do as well as they have done. But we actually did an impact survey, and what was really interesting is we looked at sort of 400 respondents, and they, critically, we saw a 10% increase in readers who believe the government should take action on foreign aid after reading what we had written about foreign aid. So that shows that if people know more, they care more. The vast majority believe the government should take action on aid if it was effective. And there was a lot of discussions in the comments under articles about rethinking aid. Obviously, this is what we're talking about. But for example, I think the sort of 90 structure of handouts is dead. We've seen how US aid, it can be wiped out in a single afternoon. Discussions about not this word localization, but leadership. We're talking about, decolonizing aid from the ground up. Really interesting discussions about that. But also that they wanted to take action themselves and they didn't know what to do about it. So I think those, just from our own readers, and they are engaged anyway because the Independent has done a lot of work on this in the past, but I think that is quite telling as well.
Thank you. You've answered quite a lot of my next questions, so that's fine. I think to that point, and I think Luke mentioned it there, that one of the first words that comes to mind with aid is wasteful, and obviously we're not telling a very good story about how we spend that, to your point, Beryl. What sort of demonstrable outcomes could we show that would actually change how the public feel about how we spend that money, and what does the data sort of show that they would like to see to actually have that productive conversation to change the conversation around how useful aid is?
So I think the first thing is tangibility. We're in an era of immense public scepticism. It could apply to almost anything I was talking to you about across the things that we look into. So it needs to be tangible. People need to be able to know that it's making a difference. As I said, I think there is strong support for the mutual benefit argument. And there's no doubt that when you look at something like, for instance, provision of vaccines and the work of Gavi, that enjoys significant support amongst the public. We found 59% backing for something like that. And we've dug into that in focus groups. And yes, people, think it's important that we support vaccinating those who might not be able to have the means to do them themselves. But there is a self-interest argument there. People will say openly in focus groups, I do not want those diseases coming to the UK. And some people might be a bit squeamish about that argument, but it really matters for the British public, again, at a time when the purse is constrained. I think the second thing is just on that perception of waste. There's a sense that when money is wasted, there is then never any effort to reclaim it. And we hear this a lot in the focus groups. You know that the PPE scandal shaped a lot of attitudes in the UK, and one of the most frustrating things was, why aren't we getting this money back? It is similar with what are perceived as wasteful aid projects as well.
And to the other two panellists as well, the same question.
I just wanted to riff off the idea of a concrete case. I mean, I think that's something where we can get the British government, the British public really energised. So, for example, I've been looking at the issue of the unprecedented aid cuts to HIV programmes globally with USAID. Basically, even though they're keeping pet for it's atrophied the entire ecosystem of delivery, and the UK has obviously cut $150 million pounds to the Global Fund, and we expect further cuts of the ODA. The thing is, what I've realised in my reporting and the response from the readers is that this could be a success story for the UK. It really could. There's lots of different ways that could happen. One, for example, we have what's been widely called a miracle drug, the closest thing to a vaccine, lenacapavir, being rolled out this year. That won't be effective if it's not properly rolled out, and we need to learn from the mistakes of the antiretroviral rollouts, all those years ago. That's actually not an inconceivable amount of money. Let's say it's $40 per person per year. And this will basically has a kind of 100% efficacy rate to stop people from getting HIV. If we need like 10 million doses of that, that's actually a kind of manageable amount of money that could be communicated to the public. I mean, I did some basic maths. It's about, I think, like £5 per adult in the UK or whatever. That's happening now. We could end the AIDS pandemic by 2030. That's possible. The UK could be the owner of that, just like George Bush with PEPFAR was the owner of, that was one of the most successful health initiatives of all time. The UK's previous investment in this has been successful, but I bet you the British public don't know about it. And this is a moment to do it right now. So, and just to add to that, at the same time with the USAID cuts, we have a US administration that has ideological bents in terms of where it wants to put aid. It will not touch LGBT plus communities. It doesn't want to touch things like family planning or reproductive sexual health organisations. We've just had an expansion of the global gag rule announced just a few days ago. The UK could step in with even limited resources to redirect aid in that efficient way. And that needs to be communicated to the public. So we're talking about waste here. Like, what about something that we can take ownership of, we can actually see positive results of, we can fill the gaps left by what used to be one of the biggest donors, and do it in a way that is actually a success story, and then communicate that to the public. And sorry, just to add one more thing, it affects everyone, right? We're talking about mutual aid. We're talking about double the number of HIV-resistant strains if these infection rates continue to surge. So it's a win-win.
Luke, you mentioned the word sort of self-interest in there. And I'm just wondering, obviously you do broader polling as well, but immigration, small boats is a really top priority for the public at the moment. To what extent are people recognising that actually aid does have a role to play in maybe managing some of those situations? And do you think there's a potential for aid, if spent in that direction, to get greater public support, because it is seen once again as being in our self-interest, even if those issues are more to do with climate, desertification and other matters, as opposed to health, education and WASH, as was mentioned earlier, which are more traditional forms of aid?
Yeah, so look, I think the public don't intuitively, immediately make that link, but when they are told about the link, it definitely does bolster support for the idea of providing aid, again, particularly with more sceptical and more socially conservative groups. The caveat that I would give to that is that then when those socially conservative, more sceptical groups are the least likely to think it will actually have an impact in doing that. So again, I think, throughout this, there's quite a lot of emphasis on, I think the aid sector has spent a lot of time telling people. I think we've got to do a lot more showing. We need concrete examples of how migration flows might have been stemmed thanks to UK aid.
Thank you. Just following on from that, I'm reflecting while I'm listening to you. Is the word aid toxic? I'm thinking ODA is actually official development assistance. So should we look more closely at the language that we're using? Because I just think aid seems to be a one direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think a perennial one that the sector has been asking itself. I think there is a challenge with talking about aid for the unidirectionality that you mentioned, Sarah, and to the point that Luke made about when things go wrong or they're perceived to go wrong, what's the accountability? And I think that's where, when we draw comparisons to spending here in the UK, for the public, the arguments that we've heard is if we're sending money overseas and it's not being done efficiently, there are no accountability mechanisms in place to make sure that we can either, take the money back or that we can ensure it's spent better going forward. And so I think there is some work to be doing around challenging that kind of unidirectionality of aid. But when we ask the public about different ways of talking about this enterprise, they understand aid. They know what we mean when we say aid. When we talk about other forms, very fancy words we can use to describe aid, they don't get a lot of support. So if we are going to have a different conversation, and we've heard arguments around investment or partnership, and we heard lots from our previous colleagues about kind of co-design and co-creation. That's okay, but I think we need to do that with a single voice as a sector, as a government, and really start bringing the public along with us.
Hey, thank you very much, Chair. And Belle, I'm going to come to you first, but after again reinforcing the congratulations to you and to the Independent for the work that you've done in highlighting particularly the impact of cuts in relation to the support for HIV/AIDS and highlighting that publicly. And as you know already, that's going to lead to a debate in the House of Commons on the global response to HIV/AIDS, in which some of the issues you touched on earlier can be fully debated. But I wonder what you think about how what the government could do now to inspire more confidence in what UK aid is spent on.
I think, just putting my journalist hat on, we would just love more transparency just as journalists. We have limited information. So, for example, we know there's going to be funding cuts to ODA. We don't know when, what they are. We thought they're going to be at the end of last year. We don't know. So that means as a journalist, we're going to write words like, like chaos, basically, or lack of clarity. That we're not going to write positively about it. And, I'm not saying that we need to be mouthpieces for the government. I'm just saying that the response to that will be negative media because we just don't know. And at the same time, there's supposed to be a conference on the future of aid, for example, that the UK is supposed to be hosting. It's in May now. I heard about this last week, but we heard it was going to be in March. We haven't been communicated about that. That again is a moment where we've lost potential positive feedback. And I think there's got to be better communication to the government to the people about where the money is going and why. And that is why I think, language does matter. I do think we should stick to the word aid because I think people trust it rather than other words. But, for example, like I'm saying, if we're talking about filling the gap that's been left, if we can explain how this is an efficient use of limited resources, and if we can really hone where the money is going and show the impact of that, and also talk historically where the UK has done a good job, and focus on concrete cases that could be successful, I think that would make a big difference. But yeah, as a journalist, just communication would be really helpful because it's quite frustrating trying to even just find out what the landscape is of this.
I mean, yes, I think that transparency is important, and I agree that comms should be clearer in terms of. But I think the comms need to be clearer in terms of talking about evidence and what has actually happened, rather than rhetoric and trying to sort of pull on the heartstrings too much. And then but I do think it's deeper than that as well. I think there is a temptation to see the public's frustration here purely as a comms challenge. I actually think it might be more a priorities challenge. And as I say, one of the things that we know very clearly is that measures around public health, vaccines, areas where you can demonstrate mutual interest go down a lot better. The challenge is, how do you actually demonstrate and show that that has happened?
Yeah, I think I would just add by some of the work that we've seen that's been particularly effective is around the role of the UK in its role in delivering aid. And where we've seen a lot of resonance with the public is not the UK as a leader in this space, not as the UK doing more than its fair share, but the UK doing our bit, the UK doing what is fair, the UK working in partnership with other countries. And so I think, just kind of picking up on Belle's argument, it seems like a really good opportunity here is to start framing this in a fairness. It's right, it's fair that the UK does its fair share. And one way that we can do that is by going into this area and providing a solution to a problem, that it's outcomes focused. It's driven by what we want to achieve rather than the input, or rather than something about our role in this space kind of on the global stage. And I think bringing those two together could be really beneficial. I just want to say maybe something, because I think there's some interesting work here that we've done with Comic Relief and FCDO has funded. And our previous colleagues were speaking to it about co-production and partnership, localization agenda, whether you want to call it decolonization or others. What we have seen from work from the UK public are three things that really stand out. I've mentioned value for money. It is the most important thing for the UK public, that this enterprise of aid is bringing value for money. But second and third is capacity building. They were under the impression that what we were doing for the last 30 years with UK aid was building capacity in recipient countries to make sure that those local communities had the skills, the technical skills, to then go on and deliver this. And it was this real emphasis, third, on locally led decision making, that you're giving people the power, the autonomy to make those decisions over a period of years so that they can flex that money and trust them to do that. And what was really interesting is, whilst we might have these conversations and we think about power and decolonialism, the actual mechanism of those really aligned with what the UK public thought aid should be for and thought what aid should be doing. And so I think we're in some good space here to think and talk about UK aid as building capacity, building the ability to kind of make these enterprises sustainable, these programs sustainable.
Can I add just one point? I'm just going to say, I think that's particularly important right now because of the collapse of US aid, because the British public are seeing how an old structure could be wiped out in a single signature within a few hours of someone's presidency, and just from our reporting, just what the kind of cataclysmic impact of that is. So there actually also needs to be, at the same time, I believe, a confidence building in aid as a thing, because people are like, well, this has been going on for ages, I don't understand, and now it's all just gone and everything's going backwards and it was able to be wiped out in an afternoon, and what's the point of this? And that's where discussions about doing aid in a better way, decolonizing aid, whatever the phrases you want to use, rethinking aid is actually vital right now more than ever.
How do you think that aligns with the messages that some NGOs give out? Because if we had spent our afternoon watching daytime television rather than being at this committee, we would have seen a lot of adverts from NGOs which convey an impression of hopelessness and a suggestion that all this has been done over many years, yet the situation is not getting any better. In fact, it's getting worse. And how do you think ultimately can align a positive message you want to give, as you, the type of message, Jennifer, you alluded to, with this message which seems to underpin fundraising, which is a hopelessness message.
I mean, my view is that, in terms of that erosion of public support, that the messaging from aid NGOs has played a significant role on a number of levels. I think one is exactly as you say, people say in focus groups, I'm still seeing the same things that I saw 40 years ago, so clearly this is a waste of money. Why are we bothering to do this anymore? But I would say secondly, the fact that the response to so much of the shift from point 7 has been it's been constant arguments about the quantum of funding and the amount going in rather than a discussion about what aid achieves and what we're trying to do has been difficult. And I would add a third point here, and I understand, especially from a technical point of view and a moral point of view, the desire to focus on narratives around decolonisation. For most of the public, that is seen as a bit of a distraction, and what it can come across is a bit of that I put in money, I pay, you calling me a colonialist because I want to help people in another part of the world. And I think that introspection, which has dominated the UK aid sector, particularly in the early 2020s, has actually been quite harmful, particularly with more socially conservative groups who you need to bring on board.
Can I just add to that? Because I think Luke's right. And one of the things that we really saw in this research was the way that the sector has been having the conversation, which is really thinking about decolonialization, power. This is not a conversation that the British public wants to have. In fact, they feel very uncomfortable talking about power structures and who has power. They feel very worried that they might be called a colonialist. But when you take away those kind of ways of having the conversation and you get underneath that and you think about capacity building, that's going to sustainability, that's going to the old adage of teaching a man to fish. And that aligns really well with what the public want to hear. So if we can talk in a way that is about building capacity, building resilience, making this locally led with partnership, I think we're in a much safer space than we are talking about the kind of politics of how we do aid.
And I do think the media is responsible as well, by the way. So I apologise on behalf of every journalist. It's that classic thing where, a news story is only a bad news story, right? And this is something that we struggled with our project, which we were very lucky to be supported by the Gates Foundation, which gave us more space, actually, to be able to think on it. But first of all, we just had to show what had happened. So like USA cuts and cuts globally, which of course is a bad news story. But then since then, it's been, moving forward as we move forward this project, it's about looking at solutions-based journalism, which hopefully we may see a change also in those NGO adverts as well. And I think that can make a major difference. And I think, I use phrases like decolonizing aid. I don't think I would use that in an article because I don't think anyone would like it. But, for example, there's an amazing organization in Sudan, the emergency response rooms, and that is an incredible, way of turning aid on its head, in my opinion. Maybe I'm saying that naively, but that's the kind of stuff that we were writing about because it's exciting and we can do it in a way that's engaging. And so, capacity building is probably also not a phrase I'd use in journalism, but that sort of emotion behind it, like something new, something different, something that's going to work, something that's better. And then something that's sort of solutions driven, basically. And, all journalists, we need to think that in the back of our minds as well.
Could I ask a question? So I would, I don't want to be mean, but the independent readers are sort of lefties. On the doorstep in Rotherham, I am always delighted when it's someone from either a diaspora community or who has faith, because they seem to be the people who are asking me exactly what I'm doing, whether it's to build capacity or whatever language that they use, because they're appalled about what they're seeing and that we're not being more generous. From a data point of view, do you break it down into people's, why people that like it like it?
So Luke and I might have a nuanced discussion here about why people like aid. So I think I mentioned the kind of aid in the for need, right? Our data has strongly suggested that if you're just going to talk one way about why we do this, it's to help people in need, and we should help and we can. And we've talked about that as being kind of a soft moral argument. It's not a moral imperative, but that it aligns with a strong sense of fairness that the British public have. So I do think that if we're trying to have a conversation about what motivates people, there is a strong sense that this is the right thing to do and that we should help if we can. And that tends to work for the vast swathe of the British public. Now, I think where Luke and I have had interesting conversations about mutual interest and national interest, we have not found, except for a very, very small proportion of the UK population, particularly centre-right audiences, that national interest arguments work. It just doesn't work in the round for a very, very, very small group. For some, it actually turns people off. They don't see this as a way of making UK PLC better. Where we have seen some more movement, and where Luke has already spoken to, why do we do this? I think there's a challenge here about mutual interest arguments. Yes, they work well with respect to vaccines. They were particularly helpful in talking about global health challenges as we came through the pandemic. Where I think we can go, or where there's a challenge is can we better articulate what the mutual interest is for the UK public? And I think that's a little bit more to what Belle was saying about bringing this. Can we bring the argument into the household and articulate how UK aid is helpful to people in their household, in their everyday orientation? And in the communications that we've done and we've seen so far, we typically aren't bringing it home to people's level that they operate and think of. And I think for us to mutually kind of explore how that might work is, can we make that narrower?
What would that look like?
So one way that we've started to look at this, Sarah, is we've likened it when we talk about the impacts of climate change. Okay, so if we spend aid and we spend aid in areas that help us deal with the impacts of climate change, that's going to help us. That's a lot of work for the average member of the public to do. So what we're saying is climate impacts are difficult. They're going to really reshape the way that affects us. But what we need to do is say, the thing that climate's going to do is it's going to cause flooding in your local community. That flooding is going to then, you're going to need to draw on your insurance. That's going to drive up insurance rates. So the actual cost to you of this big phenomenon out here, which is it's going to cost you more in terms of your insurance. It's going to cost you more in terms of the air that you breathe. It's going to cost you more in terms of local health impacts. And I think it's just probably about narrowing that funnel to take something that's big and complex like development and climate and try and bring it in a space that the public can engage with at a kind of more intrinsic or innate level.
See, I get that on climate finance. How would that work on something like early intervention on conflict or LGBT rights in a country?
We saw, so we have some data that does suggest that aid to make us more safe and secure and to bring peace is really important and does resonate with the public. Where I think we haven't taken our communications is beyond that statement, right? So aid to make the UK safer, aid to make the UK more secure. What does that mean for us? Can we thread that line of argument to say, when we invest in a conflict in Sudan, it has these outcomes, which means that this for us here in the UK, it means we are not spending money in terms of our defense budget, we're doing it differently. I think it's just about how we narrow that large, really difficult concept to something that people can engage in so that we can see if those arguments work better.
So on the LGBT, that would be, it would be safe for you to go on holiday to this country if you weren't likely to be?
Potentially, yes.
Okay, yeah. Luke.
Yeah, I mean, and we should stress, agreeing with Jennifer, I think it is just a nuance in where our research comes out. But what we find is that there can be some susceptibility to social desirability bias when it comes to the moral argument. And the problem that we often find is it doesn't then survive contact with the second order arguments around prioritization. So very often I will hear in focus groups, I would love to do this, but we've got homeless people on the streets, or, you know, and we often get people saying, I know this sounds really bad, but can we not do stuff that helps us do it as well? So I think it's when it hits that second order thing that the mutual interest. And I think it is possible to split hairs too much on national versus mutual. I don't think many people think it's purely national, because why are you sending the money board? It's the sort of mutual interest. And I do think on that early conflict piece, we find one of the most strongest arguments that you can test in terms of building support is around national security. And I think that is particularly true at this moment in time, to build on what Belle was saying, when people are feeling totally discombobulated and they want to know we are doing everything that you can do to make us safer here at home, and they will recognise a foreign dimension to that.
See, Luke, this is why we should have had 3 data people, because you've completely contradicted what Jennifer just said. So, Belle, you get the casting vote.
No, yeah. Oh my goodness, pressure's on. I mean, I just wanted to make a couple of observations. I mean, yes, the independent readership is very engaged in international affairs and foreign aid. I mean, that's been a sort of brand in the 40 years that we've been in existence. But I think, you know, when we're talking about this communication, you know, it is difficult to argue that foreign aid is important for national security when the foreign aid budget's being raided for defence, right? I mean, that's a direct contradiction. So I don't know if we need to raid foreign aid for defence. I mean, that's another whole panel, which I won't start. But I'm saying that obviously directly contradicts that point. But I also think that there is, you know, the British public do care about the outside world. You know, I think mutual aid is really, really important. I mean, especially with health, it's, like I said, with HIV, we're talking about double the number of HIV-resistant strains, and viruses have no borders, as we've all learnt when we all became epidemiologists in the pandemic. So, although some people have forgotten that. But, you know, I do think people do care, and that's probably why NGOs are still, you know, running adverts that are very sad, pulling on heartstrings. But, you know, the British public do care, and that we have, you know, a very diverse British public with a lot of people who are connected to many, many countries. And I think, you know, the previous panel was talking about activating diaspora. That's maybe something that we can do as well. You know, I love that idea of there being just as much money in that direction. But yes, it's a difficult one. And just one last thing I wanted to say, you know, talking about national security, we need to be really careful that we don't play into dangerous rhetoric. Like, I'm very nervous when I'm talking about resistant strains of HIV travelling around the world, because I don't want to suddenly demonise every single person who's coming from abroad to the UK, because we have an incredibly diverse public, an incredible country full of really interesting people, and we benefit hugely from that. So we need to also be careful in that messaging, that we're not making people frightened of the outside world, and therefore somehow we're throwing money as a kind of, like, you know, shield. So I don't know if I've answered the question of which one is correct and their nuances, but, you know, that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I want to ask you about sort of scrutiny and maybe actually just bring it on then to who people would believe, because we do have scrutiny of the aid budget. This committee is a significant part of it, and we've produced over the years numerous worthy and detailed reports. We have the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, although the government may wish to get rid of it. And we have the National Audit Office all, you know, trawling through. Do these bodies have an impact on public thinking, ourselves included, or you know, in terms of influencing to say, you know, I mean, and I've seen numerous newspaper articles that have highlighted all these obscure wastes of, you know, wastes of money that we're spending money teaching people to sing round a campfire and all the rest of it. You know, if I held up my ICAI report, would that have any impact in countering that view?
Well, I think that the sort of proof is slightly in the pudding, in that there hasn't, you know, we've had these organisations, we've had your very important reports, and it hasn't shifted those perceptions. And I think part of the challenge, to sort of link back to what I was saying earlier, is that I think scrutiny is often, you know, it doesn't have an impact. It's impotent if there aren't then consequences and clawbacks. So what people really want to know is, okay, this report has been done, this was wasteful. What is going to happen as a result of that? So I think I think you're almost better not having the scrutiny if the scrutiny doesn't have any teeth or any ability to claw back and make the taxpayer think, actually, we've got something back from this.
Obviously, some of it does demonstrate that good things happened as well.
So I'm going to speak without some data to back it up, but I'm going to answer your question in saying, no, it doesn't have an impact on the British public. But I think I want to qualify that. The reason I would qualify it, because where we do have a lot of evidence is when we run our panel surveys, we're asking 6,000 of British respondents how they think and engage with ODA and development. And we ask them about the contact points that they have with global poverty. Somewhere between 80 and 85% of the touch points, the stories that they hear about aid and development are negative. Now, that's whether they hear it through the broadcast news, through whether they hear it through a Twitter feed, whether they hear it on the front page of a newspaper. And so I think the challenge we're facing is that this committee, ICAI, all of those places that are providing and evaluating the impactfulness of aid are coming up against a much broader narrative, a set of touch points which are the public is hearing 100 times more than they're hearing an ICAI report. So I think we're not fighting the kind of same battle here in terms of is ICAI doing the things we want it to do, because the way the public are hearing about the story and the way they're engaging is not kind of via ICAI. I would say two other points. There may be a risk if ICAI were to be taken away, and there isn't this kind of independent evaluation body, and I think there's a question that we can ask the public whether that's valuable or not. But where we also have seen the import of responding to areas of corruption or waste or inefficiency, all of our data has said whenever cases of corruption or inefficiency have emerged, it's really important for the government to counter those, for NGOs to counter those. You need to respond to the challenges that aid are facing. And we, and I say that we collectively, we've shied away from that, because getting into the kind of intricacies, the difficulties of working in high-risk environments, that things don't always work to plan, hasn't been our communications forefront. And so I think I would just say on the premise of your question, it's probably not obvious on prima facie that ICAI is the validation tool for the public, but we need to think about other ways in which the public are hearing and engaging with aid, and can we use other mechanisms to reassure them that it is robust, that it is being effective and spent well.
What would those, I mean, that's the big question, what would those mechanisms be?
So we often talk within the sector about spokespeople for aid. 2 decades ago it was Bono. Who's speaking for aid these days? The consensus around aid has fallen. Government itself is now cutting aid, and that sends a strong signal to the public about its value. And so I think a question for us is, where are these spokespeople? Who can talk about this as a value proposition that is important to the British public, and left, center, and right? And how do we make the case for aid differently? And so, David, I don't have an answer to your question about who that person is, but what I would say is, we can't remain silent in the ways that we have before and shied away from some of these challenges if we want to have the British public with us and have a compelling argument for aid.
Absolutely. I mean, Sarah has a pet project views, and I do too, in the sense of, I mean, I feel strongly that the corporatization of NGOs led to the breakup of a sort of army of local advocates for aid, so that if you were at a local event and somebody had read something in a newspaper, you who were in the Red Cross, for example, a cadre, were there to counter that. And now you don't, within each community or you don't have that body of people on the ground, of people who would be authoritative in their community or speaking in a social setting. And I think my personal view is that has been a big part of the loss of support. But I don't know. I don't have an easy solution to how you put that back together.
We do have, though, a lot of evidence that people are much more likely to trust on these issues their neighbours and people around them in the community than they are politicians than others. So I think it's a particularly important point, and I would take it a step further that people have stopped their relationship with the aid sector and aid charities being local people and local volunteers, and now often it will be the sort of chuggers who are stopping people on the street. So it's totally changed the nature of that personal relationship that people have with the aid sector. So I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, it's more of an observation, but I mean, you know, for example, at the Independent, we're playing with different ways of interacting with the aid community and also just campaigning. I mean, obviously newspapers have taken campaigns, and everyone usually at Christmas time does a charity campaign to sort of raise donations from readers. But, you know, we recently launched a coalition effectively, which, you know, David, you know about, you know, trying to call for, you know, the protection of UK funding for HIV/AIDS, but it's an interesting mix because it's, you know, it's a newspaper, it's UN agencies, it's aid groups, you know, that focus on this. It's cross-party MPs and peers all coming together as something that, you know, is, we hope, efficient and effective and easily reachable. But, you know, that kind of way of doing things differently is maybe what needs to be explored. And maybe what we're all really talking about right now is that we're seeing a paradigm shift in the concept of aid. And I know that sounds very academic and not very helpful, not very practical, but, you know, it's clear that that's happening, and that needs to be reflected in the way that the government moves forward. You know, especially when we're talking about doing aid more efficiently, because obviously that's where the scrutiny comes in, especially when we're talking about, you know, leadership at a local level. When we look at even just organisations like ERRs, I think there's just, we almost need to sort of rip up the playbook from before, because it's gone. And I think we saw that most dramatically with it, you know, with USAID sort of basically atrophying. So, I mean, I'm not really sure where I'm going with this point, but we're talking about new beginnings, basically.
Well, Belle, let me bounce off your point, because I agree. I think that the British public are incredibly generous and want to support people wherever they are in the world. But I think the space has become quite toxic and polluted. I think that people are, and you alluded to it earlier, they don't want to be seen or criticised as a white saviour, a colonialist. They don't want to have the people who might attack them for helping those overseas rather than helping your own. You're not a patriot if you're giving money away. So it's almost, how do you create the language and the safe space for people who do believe in supporting humanity, capacity building, whichever way you want to present it as. Is that the role of government? Is that the role of the charities themselves? Is that the role of the media? Where do you see that responsibility?
I think, honestly, and not to be a cop-out, but I think it's everyone together, you know, because we are talking about an entirely different way of trying to do things effectively. But I do think, you know, and again, the media is responsible for this because, you know, obviously, and I find myself falling into this pattern myself, just simply because I am myself as a human being when viewing all of this, not very positive. But I think, you know, I'm trying to approach it, you know, with emotions like, I mean, like pride, I guess, you know, dignity, shared mutual, I don't know, beliefs. You know, I think it's well known in psychology that people are much, you know, people want to feel proud of something and that it's effective rather than know that things are just, you know, terrible. So I think it's everyone coming together basically in a way to make a big change.
Education. Luke, is there any evidence that campaigns within a school setting or an education setting or somewhere here like King's College that actually, though that type of effort can shift perceptions of how effective aid has been or could be in the future?
Well, two things. I mean, we know that there is more support for aid amongst younger people in general. I don't think we have, we don't have, Jennifer might have evidence whether there is a direct causal link there, but it seems reasonable to assume there is. But there's a secondary point that we know from data kind of across volunteering and engagement, that if people start engaging in practices at a younger age, such as, you know, volunteering, supporting footing, they're much more likely to carry on with that as well. So, as I say, I don't have the direct causal link, but I think the evidence we do have allows us to paint a picture there.
Jennifer?
Just to support what Luke said, I think it's exactly right. The data that we've had for the last decade shows just a consistently high level of support amongst young people, engaging them at a young level. It's building in that socialization. It's building in that muscle memory of how to be a part of this conversation. I think what we have seen from some of our work with young people is a desire to have different ways of engaging that have been quite traditional. We still in the sector talk about donating as a principal way of engaging. The NGOs are much better in this space, but young people think about engagement in drastically different ways than I would think about engagement. And so are we offering the right set of opportunities for young people? That requires a different set of thinking than just, you know, a trip overseas. But how can they do it digitally? How can they do it at a moment's notice? How can they do it in a different way than you and I might have been socialized to engage with issues? And I think that's an important thing that as we think about our colleagues earlier, are we providing a platform of ways of engaging that can facilitate them being a part of this issue?
That. I mean, certainly just in the media world, we're seeing that play out. Like, people are getting just their news and their information from unverified sources on different social media platforms like TikTok, for example. And that's another issue that maybe will come into play with this is the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation. And that's something that we have to contend with as well when you're trying to, you know, communicate what, I don't know, aid program you're working on, especially with the younger generations who are, you know, being flooded with information, most of it wrong or AI driven or not. You know, take something like X, the trust and safety divisions have been decimated. So it's I'm highlighting more of a problem than a solution, but it's something that needs to also be thought about in this process.
And I guess with the diaspora communities that exist here in the UK, is there any evidence that they should be thought about differently, or there's opportunities that exist within those diaspora communities that maybe are less obvious with kind of the more traditional UK population? How would you engage those diaspora communities most effectively if you were the UK government, do you think?
I'm not sure that I have a good answer to your question, James, on how to engage them. We have lots of evidence to say that they are more supportive and engaged and inherently interested in the subject and the topic. I mean, predominantly engagement has been through remittances back home. I think it was Sapphire earlier who mentioned about kind of connecting diaspora communities and thinking about how we take the diaspora here in the UK, connect them back with organizations and institutions in their home country and do capacity building in that way. Is there a mechanism that we can do there that is kind of community to community that would be beneficial, and we're drawing on the shared experience of people living in here in the UK back at home? So I think there's something to explore there, but don't have a lot of data on different mechanisms of engagement.
Yeah, my answer will be similarly sort of partial. I mean, the particular area we've looked at this in is the related area around refugee community sponsorship, where one of the things we found is that, as you might imagine, diaspora groups have significantly greater appetite than the general public, but can also then act as ambassadors within their community to encourage other people to take part in the schemes. I think we saw that with things like the Homes for Ukraine scheme in particular, and I'm sure that the link would be the same on a broader sort of suite of aid and development related topics.
Yeah, I used to be an aid worker once upon a time, but I'm sure as an MP, I'm sure other MPs on the panel will have found similar experiences of church groups and others in our own communities that we go along and we talk to and we hear what they've got to say. And amongst those communities, you will find young people, you will find old people, you'll find all kinds of people with a wonderful sort of sense of thinking that this stuff is important. And so hooking into that essential spirit, and you'll certainly find the same thing going on in Ireland and in other countries where in fact, I believe in Ireland, the proportionately people give even more than we do here. And again, looking at things like the Glastonbury Festival and its link with aid, it's, you know, there are lots of green shoots, lots of good things happening that we shouldn't be totally despondent about.
I totally agree, and I think there is far less, actually, I think, of a challenge when it comes to the sort of more individual giving and individual support and engagement side. And I think the more I look at the evidence, I actually think one of the challenges that we face is almost a sort of whose responsibility is this anyway? And actually, shouldn't aid and development, isn't it all that stuff that church groups, at festivals, that my kids are doing when they're getting sponsored? Why is it suddenly this thing coming off my taxes as well? And so there's an interesting tension there.
Add a point here, just for observation from like what our readers are saying. I think there's maybe there's a frustration at the discrepancies between aid given to certain groups of people and not others. If we're talking about the diaspora community, for example, the massive amount of support that was given Ukrainians, which was fantastic, and you know I cover Ukraine, I've been on the front line there a lot, versus Gaza, and I think maybe it would be just. The observation of what our readers are saying is, and the people I speak to, is if there could be if the government could listen more closely to what the British public have to say and what they would like.
And perhaps more to the point, Sudan, which is
absolutely
the biggest forgotten about crisis that's happening in the world today.
100%. I mean, Sudan is right, you know, it's such an important thing to mention because it just has been completely, and you know, the media is also responsible for that as well. But I think there's a frustration that there's a sort of unilateral decision made on who gets to be looked after and who doesn't.
Can I just add a real caution there, though, that if you look at, you know, I mean, across the public in general, support for Ukraine and support for investing in Ukraine is much higher. And in part that is because, you know, for lots of people it's a simpler conflict to understand. You know, just to bring it right down, Putin bad, Zelensky good. It's interesting. Other conflicts are more challenging. And my urging would be to aid advocates, and we've seen this in other areas, is look at why people want to support Ukraine and use that as a building block for other areas, rather than looking to create some kind of Ukrainian exceptionalism and assuming it's down to race or other issues when actually the evidence doesn't support that.
I don't know whether I'm officially allowed to ask this, Chair, but I guess I want to ask each of you, ultimately, do you think aid in its future, do you think this is ever a vote winner, or is this always a vote loser?
I'll risk going first. In and of itself, I have not seen any evidence, and we've asked questions, whether this is a vote winner. Ask it in a variety of different ways. Ask, you know, would you vote for your MP, your member of the House of Representatives based on their position on aid? And the answer we get is probably not. Where I do think it is a vote winner is combined with other, let's call them global challenges, but what's the value proposition that we're putting forward about the way we want to see the world work, what we're trying to do and protect and deliver? And so if I were a politician, I would want to, you know, one approach might be I want to stand up in front of my constituents and say, I think the world has these challenges. The way I would advocate we go after them, or the way I think we need to address them, is we need to be principled around things around making ourselves safe and secure. We need to address the challenges of climate. We need to think about the interconnectedness of the world, and that means you know, how we think about development. You've got to make an argument, but to me it's not a single issue, but it is a proposition by which there is an argument out there that we are having here in the UK and the US, everywhere. And so in that vein, I do think there is a very wide constituency out there who wants to hear a story or a narrative about how this fits in amongst other things.
And I would just add, I mean, I would actually slightly nuance the idea that it's a vote loser. I'm actually not convinced that the evidence shows it is. It's quite the same. I think it's low cost politically to cut it, and it's popular to cut it. I'm not sure levels of aid are necessarily there's evidence that it's a vote loser. And I do think the area where you can tell a more positive political story, if I'm allowed to say that here, and it's obviously cross-party, is that aid done well, something like vaccines, can feed into this idea of the politics of can. Like, actually, politics can make a positive difference in people's lives that can benefit us, it can benefit others around the world too. And I think, you know, from our wider work, there's been too much of that missing. There's been a lot of politics of can't. But that, of course, then relies on being able to communicate those results, to go back to what we were talking about earlier.
And I would agree with that. I would say that, again, I mean, I personally don't think it, maybe this is incredibly naive of me, but, you know, I think aid should not be dependent on whether it's a popular thing for voting or not. I mean, we live in a global community and we just can't not do this. You know, it has a direct impact, whether we're able to communicate that to the general public or not. Like, it just is so important. But I do think that people respond well to social justice, if that's the right word to use, you know, to care, to pride and to dignity in the positive meanings of those words. And so I think it can be something that can be spoken of in a positive way to support, you know, say a political platform. But it has to be seen as a thing on its own, which is that we are in a global community. Climate impacts all of us, health, whatever it is, conflict. And you know, it'll be sometimes too nuanced to be able to explain, you know, when you're canvassing, for example, but it's so essential, it has to be a separate thing at the same time.
To play devil's advocate back to my colleague, in the 2024 election, seats were won or lost on Gaza. So it does have a powerful resonance. Tracy, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back a little bit to participation. To Bill and Luke, I think, first of all, are there ways in which you think that citizens could be more engaged in how we spend ODA, and what would that look like?
I do think that greater agency would help to build confidence, this idea that I have more of a say over things. I'm a little bit sceptical about the idea of things like citizens' assemblies simply on this issue, simply because I suspect you would attract the usual suspects and they wouldn't then act as advocates. But there have been more creative solutions proposed. I know that Ravi Guru Murphy proposed this idea of kind of individual aid accounts where people would be given a list of projects that could be supported, and they would be able to decide where their particular contribution went. We haven't tested that explicitly, but I think that is a wider mechanism, and it's the sort of thing that we know helps to build confidence in decision making generally.
Yes, and I think journalism obviously has a clear role to play here, because we can explain things and also advocate for things. So, for example, the different campaigns that we've been working on, whether it's HIV or sexual reproductive health. But, you know, for us, transparency remains a challenge. And that's, you know, that's the problem, is that we can't help communicate about ODA if we don't even know what it's going to be spent on or when that's going to be announced. So I think, I do think it's helpful to have public engagement. I'm not entirely sure how you do that on a sort of micro level, but journalism should play a major role in that. And we're finding it difficult to do that when we don't actually know what it's going to look like.
Jennifer, is there anything you want to add?
It's a really interesting question, and some research that we've done has showed when we gave the public a variety of different aid programs and the different kind of constituent parts of them. Do you want to spend in a particular country? Do you want to spend under a particular amount? Would you rather spend on need or security? Do you want to spend where we have conditionality? What we found was that by and large the public wanted to spend in places where the need was the greatest, and that overrode most all other considerations by a significant factor. So when you put those options to the public, they choose something based, they choose to spend where need is the greatest. And I think we already have quite a lot of strong signals about what the public wants aid for: health, WASH, education. So if we were to make an intervention in this space, I think we would ask ourselves maybe a little bit more refined question, which is, what do we do in these spaces that already align with where the public are at that might help them get more agency or understanding of the process, rather than open it up to think, you know, do we want infrastructure? Do we want to spend in different ways? So I think we've already got a lot of strong signals about alignment.
One way, of course, that you can do that and get that greater agency, and it's something that has been done quite a bit in the past, is co-funding. So it's, you know, you put £1 into this and we'll put £2 in, or whatever it is. Any reflection on those sorts of programs?
Where we've done work either with certain NGOs who have been co-funded by FCDO, we see some evidence that it's nice to have, that government, if you put in £1, government will put in £1. There's a little bit of reassurance that we're kind of doing something together, that you're not taking all of the risk. We've not seen a lot of evidence that that is a overly compelling driver to get people to participate, but it's a reassurance that the kind of risk is shared, or that the enterprise is seen as valued by both government and the individual. So it doesn't drive people in, but it certainly reinforces that this is, you know, something that they're happy to be a part of. Yeah.
Well, quite very early on, in terms of when people have got more information, then actually they're more attuned, aware of development, relief and aid, and therefore more likely to be sympathetic to that. And it's a question to you and to others, but do you think that with more information that's available to the public, that therefore maybe they'd have a different response? So, for example, do you think that the UK government has a role to play in terms of, and the perception of the public, in terms of the historical impact that many Commonwealth countries and undeveloped countries, where the UK has benefited from those countries, and therefore the public being aware there's a need to give something back, but also because obviously of the great needs that are in those countries themselves?
I mean, yes, I think that would be very, very important. And I think, I mean, again, we talked earlier about people not wanting to feel colonial or, you know, and sort of racist or abusive, you know, but at the same time, there's a massive lack of information. I mean, just the impact even of the British Empire isn't really taught enough in schools, you know, in my personal opinion. But I think absolutely that would be one way. But I don't know whether, like, psychologically that would mean people be more willing to give money, or whether they just shut themselves off. You know, we noticed this from our reporting. If we dig deep into the negativity of a subject constantly, this is awful to say, but the viewers just drop off. So there's a balance there between absolutely needing to do that just for the history, you know, just to right a wrong, and also move forward. But at the same time, I guess the psychology of it is you know, I noticed people have fatigue. We're obviously contesting with a lot of like immediate conflicts that are happening right now. But I think there's a way to do that, and I think it's really important. I think it's a big, big hole that needs to be filled. Absolutely, yeah.
I think it is, in terms of building a wide coalition of support for aid and development, quite a dangerous track to go down. We find that any sort of, in our testing, any sort of language around reparations appeals very strongly to the most progressive groups in the population and alienates all of the other groups as well, because it makes it not only, you know, to build on everything about negative emotions, it also makes people think that aid is then being used for political ends to advance a political agenda. So I think it would be a surefire way, unfortunately, to worsen the current levels of public support.
Strong evidence from some qualitative work that we did to exactly as Luke found, the conversation about UK's place in history, what it's done, how it might benefited, is of interest to a very, very small segment that in Dell's terms we would call the kind of fully engaged, those people who want to have this conversation, who are aware. For the rest of the public, it is a non-starter, and for many, it is very, very uncomfortable. It is politically uncomfortable for them. when we started using words like to try and unpick, do you understand the kind of power relationship? People came back and said, I don't want to talk about power. It literally makes me feel uncomfortable. And so in as much as, and I think the sector has been having this conversation, in as much as we may want to, from a value base, say that this is important that we do that, we have a very, very long way to go to have that conversation with the public. And if we choose to do it, it will really not land well with a very, very large segment of the public. So I think there's risk.
So it's nice just to be able to get that out. But
can I just, sorry, just to add to that,
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
maybe we need to work. The problem is that we're asking people now with the lack of information that they have and thoughts already in their brains. Like maybe this is more of an indication of how the education system has failed. Basically, I mean, not to widen this conversation, but if I don't know, if I feel like people would have that response because they wouldn't necessarily even know, and they don't really want to think about it. So I think if it is to be done, I think it's important, but it needs to be done in a way that is more, I don't know, starts earlier. I don't know. I just think it is an important conversation, and it's sad to me that we can't have it because it's the truth.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to raise one more thing, and that is when I was growing up, when I was in my teenage years, there's the Bob Geldof song, We Are the World, We Are the People. Let's make this a better place. There's something about language, how we use it, bringing people together, and there's something around, and you've already mentioned it in many of our parts of our conversation, in terms of who's responsible for that, who's responsible, and does that responsibility lay in terms of improving people's situation and getting them out of poverty. So if anybody's listening to this, or if you get any contacts where actually something could happen on a more global basis to bring about something as coherent as We Are the World, We Are the People that Bob Geldof led, was absolutely fantastic. And I think we need something more like that.
And I think that is a lovely point to end on. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, witnesses. We are aware that imminently we're going to get the budget allocations, which will be the priorities, so whether that's health, wash and education, but also the countries that are likely to be focused on. And I also want to raise that we're looking at a 25% reduction, at least, in FCDO staff. So there is a lot going on. We aim to get our report that you've now fed out into the public domain as quickly as we possibly can to try and influence what those priorities and principles are that the government works to. Thank you all very much. Thank you, audience, for your written contributions. Please do keep them coming in. Order. This session is now closed.